You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hi there, and welcome to Campus Talks, the podcast in which we seek out insights and advice to support the work of those in higher education. I'm Miranda Prynne, and this week we're focusing on the relationship between assessment, feedback, and learning. We'll be asking, what purpose does or should university assessment serve? How educators can shift the focus of assessment towards feedback and ultimately learning. Where universities have been going wrong on assessment and why. And, of course, no podcast on assessment would be complete without touching on how GenAI is affecting all this. So, to help me untangle this vast topic, which often elicits strong opinions and emotions from students and staff alike, I am joined for this episode by David Boud, the Deakin Distinguished Professor at Deakin University and a leading scholar on all things assessment and feedback. David is the Foundation Director of Deakin's Centre for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning. He's also an Emeritus Professor at the University of Technology, Sydney. He has been a pioneer in learning-centred approaches to assessment and is one of the most highly cited academics in the world on teaching, learning and assessment in higher and professional education. So who better than David to help us better understand how educators can put exams in the service of learning? I started off by asking him about feedback and what constitutes good feedback literacy, as this is an area where universities often fall short in student surveys, and yet one which sits at the heart of assessment for learning. So, let's hear from David. Hi David, great to have you on Campus Talks.
Hi, I'm very pleased to be here.
Let's talk about feedback literacy, as this is a really big focus of your work. Can you define what you actually mean by it?
Yeah, well, I think we need to start with the idea of feedback, because the idea of feedback has shifted quite a bit over the last 10 years. I think most people think about feedback in a higher education context as a university teacher making comments on students' work, normally after there's been some form of grading. So that's been the conventional view. And the idea has been that good feedback is giving good comments to students that represent issues and problems with the students' work and things they might be able to do something about. But it's normally very tied in with what the student's already done and where they've already been. And what's happened over the last 10 years or so is we're thinking about feedback quite differently. So rather than taking a teacher-centered view of feedback, that is, feedback is what teachers do, we take a learning-centered view of feedback, and that is, it's all about what students do. And the reason for that is that feedback is essentially about learning. It's not what about the student has done in the past, it's about what they can do in the future. So the issue is not justifying grades or whatever on the basis of some assignments students have done. It's about saying, well, given that, where do we go from here? What do I need you to do as a student to move forward, do better work, meet the outcomes, and so on and so forth? So it's moving from the idea of a teacher-focused input to a student-focused contribution for learning. And that's how we need to judge it. So we need to judge it in terms of what the student is able to do with input.
So that almost sounds more of a sort of feed forward than a feedback. But does that suggest, or are you suggesting that we need to sort of separate feedback from assessment?
Yes, I mean, I've written a paper with Naomi Winston at the University of Surrey, which actually does exactly that, basically disentangling the Assessment Act, which is the act of grading and making a judgment about a piece of work, from feedback inputs, which is saying, well, given this, where do we go from here? So that's the kind of future focused notion of feedback. And I don't like to use the word feed forward because using the word feed forward probably indicates a bit of a misunderstanding about what feedback is. Feedback necessarily is about going forward. It's rather unfortunate that it's got the word back embedded in the word. So that gives people the kind of the wrong idea. But all feedback is about what happens next rather than what's happened in the past.
Okay, so then moving on to feedback literacy, how does that fit into this definition of feedback?
Well, there's two kinds of feedback literacy. There's a literacy that students need to have in terms of being able to utilize feedback processes well. And then there's the feedback literacy that staff need to have in order to design good feedback processes, things that work and that are embedded effectively in courses. So from the student point of view, the reason we started to talk a lot about feedback literacy is under this new conception of feedback, a lot of what is involved is what students do. So we need to ensure that students understand what feedback is, how it works, and can use it for themselves. And that's basically what feedback literacy is about. And some students need inducting into the idea of what feedback is and how to make it effective for themselves, and to shift them away from the idea that, well, I just sit there and the teacher feedbacks me. That's not a very kind of useful way of thinking about things. So, for example, one of the things about feedback literacy is the importance of students eliciting information from other people and not just waiting until it turns up. So we've unfortunately got this habit in courses in which we have an assignment, students complete the assignment, it gets marked, and then feedback is kind of just a necessary part of that marking process. And this is not a very helpful way to think about it. If we think about normal everyday life, somebody who offers us unsolicited information about what we do and where we're going and what we should be doing in the future, we push back against that. We resist that because we don't have a kind of personal contract with someone to do that. So we need to take that idea and bring it into the learning context, and that is encourage students to think about what they need to ask for rather than just waiting for delivery of whatever turns up. And that is a way of effectively engaging them more in the whole feedback and the learning process. So, I mean, one of the really simple things you do as a practical example, normally most assignments have a kind of cover sheet you hand in with your personal details on it, your student number and so on. One of the simple things that people do is they put a little box on that cover sheet and ask students to say, what would you particularly like to receive comments about on this work? And we need to encourage students to kind of complete that. And we need to give them some examples of the kind of things they might say, because what we don't want them to do is say to us, oh, well, whatever it takes, whatever you like to give me, I'll be happy with that. The message we need to get across to students is, if you don't ask us what you want, then you might not get what you want. So it's a way of encouraging them to be rather upfront about what is going to be helpful in their learning rather than just waiting.
Yeah, I can see that's a small change, but actually could be a very powerful one. A quick aside, I mean, how difficult is it to persuade students that feedback needs to be focused on learning and in their minds and their mindset, separate it from just the grading and assessment aspect? Is that quite an uphill challenge?
It is. It's something we need to take seriously, and we need to devote some time to persuading students of the importance of that. We have some very, very bad habits in the past. National Student Survey, not just in the UK, but in a whole range of other countries that we've looked at, has these surveys of students' opinion of courses in which feedback is constructed as teachers' comments on their work. And by and large, most universities don't do very well on that item. The problem there, though, is that we're cementing this old idea of feedback as only being about what teachers do. So we need to create a kind of a new discourse with students about, well, feedback is about learning, one, and two, learning needs to involve you and for you to be an active agent in this. And therefore, we need to construct things in such a way that you are a player. You're a player before you get input from other people, and you're a player after you get an input.
I know one of your areas of focus has also been on the need to develop feedback literacy, not just among students, but actually among lecturers and tutors and university educators as a whole. What has your research in this area revealed about what constitutes strong feedback literacy among educators?
Yeah, well, I think we can talk about it in almost two levels. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that, but it's a simple way of getting into it. What I used to do, and what so many of my colleagues used to do, is they get students' work and they make comments about that work. They make comments which are as good and as clear as they can make to indicate what the problems and strengths are of that work. Now, that is one level of feedback literacy, to make better comments, but that's really only the starting point. Real feedback literacy amongst university teachers is about how they design feedback processes in the first place. So, for example, a lecturer with good feedback literacy, they'd be asking themselves, where is the best point of time in order for students to undertake a task that if they get information and a feedback input on that, they can actually improve what they do whilst the course is still active. So deciding about when assignments should occur is a part of feedback literacy. Another part of it is about timing. Now, traditionally, we've thought about timing as how long should students expect to wait before they get comments on their work? And different institutions have different time periods, like 10 days, 2 weeks, or whatever. But that is not the most important time period as far as feedback is concerned. The most important time period is the time between when they get useful information about what they can do and what they do next. So if they get that information after the next assignment, it's mostly wasted because they haven't had the opportunity to actually make sense of that input before they do the next task. So we need to very carefully design activities and when we do things and how we set them up so that we have the opportunity for a feedback loop to be completed. Now, ideally, many feedback loops to be completed within the semester. Now, there's a limit on how many we can fit in, but we need to get maybe a couple necessarily.
Can you talk me through what a really well-designed feedback process would look like?
First of all, there would be a task that students do. Could be any task. It could be in any mode, any way you like. It could be a performance. It could be a piece of writing or whatever. And that then needs to be located at a point in time where students will benefit from getting an input about their performance on that task and what they do next. So it needs to be in the earlier rather than later part of the semester so that there's time for them to do something about it. But it can't be so early that we haven't actually learned anything yet. So sometime in maybe the first end of the first third of the course, we might put an assignment in. We may grade it or we may not grade it. So grading isn't a necessary part of feedback, but often they happen to kind of coincide. So that will be one feature. We might have students getting inputs from other people. They might show it to a peer, get some information from a peer. And the value in that isn't just the comments they receive from the peer, but the fact that in order to communicate to one of their peers, they have to get their ideas together. They have to be really clear about what they're doing, and they have to communicate it very well. So that peer feedback is a learning process over and above the particular bits of information that you receive from your colleague. Then students complete the task, they hand it in, they get comments from tutor or whoever's doing that. And then we need to think about the comments that we make in terms of what is it realistic for students to do. One of the things that often happens is students are very discouraged because a very kind of dutiful tutor will comment on all the things that need to be done. And this might go on for, a page or two. And this, for some students, can be incredibly off-putting. I interpret as saying, well, I'm just not good enough. I'll never get there. This is more than I can handle. So we need to think very carefully about what do we say to students that will encourage them and enable them to actually do better work within the same course. So crafting those comments is important, and we need to think about those comments in terms of the students learning. Then we need to encourage students to actually go through a process of reading those comments. And believe it or not, the students that most need to benefit from feedback are the ones that least read the comments. So that is a very serious issue. The underperforming students are the least likely to read the comments. The people most likely to read the comments are the higher flying students who want to fly even higher. So we get students engaged in those comments. We might even give them a little task, identify what you're going to do about this in your next assignment. So we then get that information to students, not just the information, but a time for students to think about that and plan what they're going to do with that in terms of what comes next. So that might be a typical process. A variation on that in assessment terms is the idea that you have a nested task. You don't just have one off task and then you go have a completely different task. You split the overall assessment into various components, various stages. And in the early stages, students might just get some feedback information. And the later stage, or the stage at the end, they will just get marks and grades. Unfortunately, we spend most time on feedback at the very point in time when students can use it least, and that's the end of semester. If we're going to spend our time well, we need to stop giving feedback information at the end. We need to have marks and we need to justify those, of course, but the feedback needs to be before that.
Which makes perfect sense. Also, your point of almost building in a task or whatever it might be that almost forces students to engage with the feedback. I can see that would be very effective. Let's turn to some of the areas where many would say higher education is and has been going wrong. One of the key criticisms, which we've already talked about here, is the fact that traditional end-of-year assessment means students only receive feedback on their performance once it is too late to use. This seems like such an obvious flaw in the system that it kind of begs the question of why assessment has for so long been designed like this. What is the reasoning? Why is this happening?
That's a very good question. I think the reason it's been happening is that we use the word assessment to cover many different things. And the needs that we have vary according to why we're doing it. So, for example, I normally think about 3 purposes for assessment. So one purpose of assessment, which is the most familiar one of all, is that of assuring students have met the learning outcomes. So we have all these learning outcomes which we expect students to come up to meet the standard for. So we have assessment activities that make a judgment on students' work. Have they or have they not met that outcome? And traditionally, we've graded that. There's a few problems with grades, but we'll just set that aside for the moment. So that's one purpose, to assure learning outcomes. The second purpose is to assist students in meeting learning outcomes as they go through a course. So that's where feedback fits in. So feedback is a mechanism that enables students to see whether they're on track, but also to improve their chances of meeting the learning outcomes by the end of the course. So that's 2 purposes of assessment, one for assurance, one for learning. And the third one is about assessment that's sustainable for the student. So we've treated assessment in the past as if it was a non-invasive measurement. But in fact, we know that assessment has a big influence on students. But the important thing we need to achieve by the time a student graduates is they need to know what they know and what they can do, and what they don't know and what they can't do. And this is what we've been calling developing their evaluative judgment. So the third purpose of assessment is to help students make better assessments of their own work. And the kind of assessment we need for that is different again from the assessment for assurance and the assessment for immediate learning. So we've bundled all these three things together, and we need to think about these three things in a disaggregated way. So, for example, assessment for assurance needs to occur late, the end of the semester, the end of the year. So that means why are we grading students early on in a semester, or indeed in their first year, and counting their grades in a grade point average or a weighted average mark that hangs around on their transcript? This is a crazy thing to do. It's got nothing to do with assurance of learning. So we need to think about some of our conventional practices that don't actually line up very well with any of these kind of notions of assessment. We need assessment for assurance late, we need assessment for learning early, and we need assessment for students making judgments all the way through.
Yes, we're asking assessment to do a little bit too much under one umbrella. Universities have always given out grades, and as anyone engaged with this topic knows, that in itself is the subject of quite a lot of debate. But I have read quite a few comments by lecturers working today who feel that students are actually even more focused upon them than they were even 10, 15 years ago. And I just wondered what you thought is driving this obsession with the final grade over proper learning gains.
Well, it goes back a long way in that I can remember the time when I was a student, or shortly after that, in which there was a big push, a big student movement towards, if we want us to do some work, we want it graded. So when I was a student, I won't say how long ago that was, but it's a fair time ago, we actually did work that wasn't graded. And we did it because that's just what you did. That's what you did as a student. You kind of did work and staff commented on it all the way through. Now, this demand for so-called continuous assessment, we gave in too easily to students and said, yeah, if we're going to set you any assignment, if you give you any task to do, we're going to grade it and we're going to count those grades. So there was an obsession by students with grades back then. And rather than challenge them and rather rethink our own focus on grades, we caved in. So a lot of what happens now is a problem that we set up for ourselves basically in the last century. The problem we've got now is a much more interesting one with regard to grades, because grades don't work in terms of the assessment we need to do. So if one of the purposes of assessment is to assure that students have met learning outcomes, grades are pretty terrible for doing that, because what we do is we give them an exam, for example, that covers lots of different learning outcomes. We grade that exam and we average students' performance over different outcomes. There's no way that can assure outcomes because we're destroying data. We're actually not judging students on the outcome. We're judging students on a mishmash of outcomes. So in this standards-based approach that most countries now have moved towards around the world, we need to rethink where grades fit in. And we need to take much more seriously the idea that we need to record student performance against outcomes rather than against subjects taken. So we actually need to even go right the way back to first principles and think about the transcript that students take with them. And the transcript we provide to students is absolutely hopeless for employers, for example. It doesn't actually communicate anything about what students do. And the only people that can make sense of that transcript are the people that created the grades in the first place. So we've coded students' performance in terms of this code of grades, and it can't be decrypted. And the focus on us in the current climate is employers need to know what students can do, Students want to know what they can do, because unless they know what they can do and what they can't do, they can't take the next step of learning. So we've kind of tied ourselves up in a bit of a problematic situation with grades.
Your point that no one's really benefiting from that is a very good one, because I think there's some perception that employers are kind of obsessed with grades, and that's what they're looking at when they're first filtering applications. But of course, as you point out, actually what they need to know is a student's capability and skills, and that grades are far too blunt an instrument to ever demonstrate that. Do you think the sort of increasingly transactional nature of higher education, with the marketization of the system in a lot of countries, has played a bit of a part, that students, they're paying into this and they want to come away with their gold certificate?
Well, yes. I mean, I'm very cautious about scapegoating neoliberalism and all that kind of thing. Yes, that is part of the context in which we operate, and it has reinforced some of these bad habits. But we just need to go back to what we're trying to do. Even if we accept, or even if we don't accept that as the frame in which we operate now, we need to ask ourselves, are we doing things that are sensible? So are we equipping students with information that they can use to find employment? Are we equipping people that might want to employ them with information that they can use? And basically, we're not doing that very well. I ran a focus group about a year or so ago with a group of graduate recruiters for a major Australian university. And I put on the screen a typical transcript, list of subjects, list of grades. And I asked them, what do you do when you get this as part of a student's application? Do you actually look at the grades? And all but one of them, all but one says, no, we don't look at the grades at all. And then I said, well, what about the subjects that students have taken? Do you actually look at those? And most of them said, no, we don't really look at those very carefully. And there were a couple of exceptions. One engineering firm said, well, yeah, we look at the courses taken to make sure they've done the right kind of engineering. And another one in an applied science area said something similar. We want to make sure that they have covered the kind of areas that we work in, but we're not very focused on exactly what they've done in that area. And I said to them, would you find information about what students could actually do in a form that communicated to you helpful? And they said, of course. What we do now is we have to run our own assessment centres, because the information we get from universities is hopeless for our needs. We can't take university assessment at all seriously.
Yeah, that's very telling. Given this challenge, but also the fact grades are baked into the education system from the word go, how can academics and others help students certainly unlearn this obsession with good grades being the ultimate goal?
Well, the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, whose obsession is it? And I'd like to argue that it isn't students' obsession. They've picked up this obsession from us. So who is it that takes grades seriously? Universities take grades seriously in terms of selecting students for postgraduate study. What often university teachers do is they use the currency of grades to talk to their students about what they're doing. They say, well, if you did this, you could get an upper second or whatever. I very assiduously with my students don't talk about grades at all. I want to talk to my students about standards and criteria and what students need to do and what does good work look like. And this is the discourse we need to use with our students, and we need to kind of suppress all our grade obsessions. Another interesting example about this obsession is I live in the state of New South Wales, and New South Wales has its own education system, and it moved quite seriously many years ago to have a standards-based, what was called higher education certificate, and that is the basic school leaving or the final school qualification. And what they were very concerned to do is to provide information that communicated what students were able to do at the end of schooling. So what did the universities do? They said, we don't want this, we want grades. So the universities took the information from the State Education Department and converted them into grades. because that would simplify the selection process for students into university. They also do the same thing for postgraduate study. So we are the culprits here. We are the people that lock in grades into the system, not the students. The students are just taking their cue from us.
Fascinating. And in many ways, that's good news because it does also mean that the power to change it lies with the universities, or certainly to really kind of move the dial on it.
There is a movement towards looking at alternatives to grades. And the irony is, of all the subjects that are in the vanguard of eliminating grades, where would you guess the most significant one to be? Well, it's medicine. Medical schools right around the world are more focused on eliminating grades than any other part of the higher education system. And the reason they're doing that is it doesn't enable them to tell whether their graduates are going to be good doctors or not.
It's not, I have to say, the subject I would have guessed. Far from it. Yeah. But it makes sense because, yes, the skills involved in being a good medic go far beyond academic grading. Moving on to essentially the pink elephant in the room when talking about anything to do with university assessment these days, AI. You have described AI, the impact of AI on university assessment as a wicked problem, which is a term usually applied to things like climate change, i.e., messy, intractable problems with no simple solution. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Yes, yes. Well, before AI came along, and it's actually been around longer than we might normally acknowledge. So before then, there was a chance that we might have a rational assessment system that enabled us to make judgments about what students could really do or not do. AI comes along and it muddies the water. And it muddies the water in a very important way, in that any student anywhere can access AI or GenAI at any time of the day or night, as much or as little as they want, irrespective of what university policy might be on whether they can use it or not. So we've got this huge change in the context in which we operate. And that leads to us calling it a wicked problem. So a wicked problem, I mean, there's 10 different criteria you judge a wicked problem. I'm not going to go into all of those. So a wicked problem would often resist definitive formulation. It doesn't offer correct solutions. Some solutions are better or worse than others, so we can only get that far. We can't test the solution without consequences, and it places very significant responsibility on the decision makers, and that is every single university teacher that makes an assessment. And there's been all sorts of solutions posed to this, but there is no solution. There's no clean solution. There's better solutions and worse solutions, and that's why it's a wicked problem. So, for example, one of the things it's called the two-lane solution. So the idea there is you have some assessments where you can freely use AI to complete them, and other assessments in which you mustn't use AI. And the problem there, of course, is if you're wanting students not to use AI, you've got to lock them up in a room without access to the internet and get them to do tasks under very controlled conditions. That is very demanding and very expensive. And what that means is that we can't do as much of that as we've done in the past. Now, some people naively think, well, let's go back to traditional exams. We put them in exam hall and we kind of have invigilators and they walk around and they make sure that they're not cheating. Well, that's already failed. We know that students cheat in exams. They substitute other people for themselves in exams, and this is not detectable by invigilators. It might in theory be detectable, but in practice it isn't. So let's stymie the idea that traditional exams have a solution to this. The other problem with traditional exams is they only enable us to judge a very small proportion, or, well, not the majority of the learning outcomes we want our students to do. So there's all sorts of clever ways of doing controlled assessment, which I won't go into because it's a whole different subject. But we've got to live with this. We've also got to live with the fact that we are training students for a world in which AI permeates everything. So when they go out and get any kind of employment, then they're going to be using AI as a part of normal everyday business. So we need students equipped to be able to use AI well. And that means we've got to have some really, really hard thinking about what are the circumstances in which we do assessment in the university with it and without it. And that's going to take an awful lot of thinking through. Most universities now have policies about this. Most of those policies have already been revised several times to today. And it's only been a few years since AI came along, GenAI came along. So we're in a state of flux at the moment. We've got a wicked problem. We don't know any clean solutions, and we're struggling to cope. And this is probably the single greatest challenge for universities of our day.
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, assessment, grading, etc., need to be put in the service of learning and feedback. And how you do that in a post-AI world, obviously, is very challenging. But just to perhaps finish on a slightly more positive note, are there some forms of assessment you think universities should be embracing more to try and rebalance this relationship?
Well, the first thing is I think they shouldn't be too nervous about students doing assessment with AI. What this means, though, is it's a big challenge to us because the kind of assessment tasks we set have to be quite different from what we've traditionally set. So if we type in our assessment tasks to ChatGPT, it will do it for us. We should only be setting assignments that if we feed it into ChatGPT, they don't give us a good outcome. So we need to think about that. We need to think about how we train students to use it well. And the situation at the moment is, and we've seen this in our own research, in exactly the same class, we can have students whose work is their learning is massively enhanced by GenAI. And in the same class, students are using AI as a substitute for their own learning. We're seeing, for example, students with a range of disabilities flourishing because of the extra support that GenAI can give them. And we've got other students who are hard pressed and they just want to struggle through the course. So that's one of the big challenges we have. I'm getting onto the negative again, I think. But one of the things that we do need to focus on is we need to focus less on grading and more on feedback. And one of the important things about this is for feedback to be effective, we need to know the student more. So we've got this dilemma at the moment. We know that it increases fairness to students, increases equity, if we don't know who it is whose work we're marking. Good evidence about that. There's equally good evidence that if we don't know who the student is and they don't know who the marker is, then feedback doesn't work so well. So we've got a kind of tension here. So what I'm hoping is that the number of assessment tasks that we control for reasons of validity will reduce. We become a lot smarter about making choices about what we really assess in that domain. And we put a lot more emphasis on tasks that students do in which they get feedback in a feedback process. So more focus on feedback, more focus on developing relationships between students and assessors or feedback givers, and also a greater recognition that students get feedback information from a whole range of humans and non-humans, and that's normal business. And the final thing I'd want to add to that little mix is that we need to do a lot more work on developing students' capacity to make judgments about their own work. And it's not just judgments about their own work, it's judgments about the output from AI. I don't know how many people have actually seen a record of a meeting that AI has contributed. I had one this very morning. I had a meeting with a research student, and one of the things that was generated automatically was the AI's view of what we discussed. I then received a few minutes later the notes that the student would make, and it was almost as if AI didn't know what the important issues were. There was a mismatch. So one of the things that we need to put a lot more effort into is helping students make those judgments about the quality of work, whether it's emanating from a peer, themselves, or AI. And if we put our emphasis on there, we've got a much more hopeful future than despairing that AI is going to take everything away from us.
Yes, and of course, if students do get better at judging their own work and the work of their peers, they are going to, by dint of that, be much better at judging the output of AI. So it all kind of works in tandem. But I have to say that, your response demonstrates perfectly why it is a wicked problem, because there is no certainty, really. These are messy issues to grapple with, and frankly, are going to require a lot of work as well. This is not going to be an easy task. David, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm very happy to contribute.
There's a huge amount to reflect on from that conversation, but a key takeaway for me was the need to separate out the different types of assessment that serve very different functions, and in separating them, enable educators to create more effective assignments and exams for the desired purpose, and at the appropriate time, rather than lumping everything in together. But the other thing that struck me was David's assertion that the unhelpful obsession with grading is not being driven by students or employers, but by the universities themselves. And the reason that stood out for me is because, firstly, it goes against a lot of generalised assumptions about students having an unhealthy focus on final grades over their learning. But more importantly, because it means it is well within universities' powers to change things up and move towards perhaps a more helpful and instructive way of evaluating students' abilities. And while GenAI may be, as David has labelled it, a wicked problem for university educators, it may at least force some sort of reckoning with a lot of these long-ignored issues. That's it for this week. I hope you found that useful. If you cannot bear to go a whole 2 weeks without a Times Higher Education podcast, do head over to our sister podcast, News Talks, hosted by yours truly, in which we get behind the headlines and discuss some of the biggest current stories in global higher ed with the journalists who are reporting on them. And you can find that at timeshighereducation.com/comment/podcasts. And of course, head to campus for much more advice and insight on all things relating to assessment, feedback, and AI at timeshighereducation.com/campus. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.